Welcome to Thrive Deeper, the show based on the Thrive Bible reading guides. This is an ongoing conversation about God's Word with Thrive author, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Good morning, Matt.
Morning, Stu.
Thrive Deeper, and have we got an episode today?
Sure have.
Me. There's a lot of stuff in this, and
that's why we call it deeper.
Yeah,
Stu,
totally, very deep. And Jesus is really getting to the pointy end of his ministry now on earth. Some of the very familiar passages, which, as you've said before, can sometimes breed too much familiarity, and we don't really understand them fully. But also, some really interesting stuff about what's going to happen after Jesus in the 70 years following his time here, which we'll come to, and then beyond that as well. But just a quick recap, we've had Jesus with the disciples, the various parables that he's told, with the feeding of the 5,000. We then had them making their way towards Jerusalem. We heard the parable of the fig tree, and then, of course, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We then had Jesus at the temple. We begin to see in greater measure the tension between Jesus and the Pharisees. And the
that's right. The fig tree is actually after that. So the fig tree is a parable about essentially an unfruitful Israel. So this is a time of confrontation. Things are becoming more polarized now. Things are really heating up. And particularly because from the moment that Jesus entered the temple and upturned the tables, he's essentially claiming authority in some sense over the temple. And so he's not making friends here, and certainly not with the religious leaders. So he's going to have, as we see here, lots of encounters with the religious leaders. He's come with quite a following, so they have to be careful.
Yes.
Because they don't want to start riots. They've got to play it really carefully with the Romans.
Yeah, they've got a foot in each camp, basically.
As well, yeah. And they're also... It's even more precarious because there are different factions even within Jerusalem.
Yes.
And there are the Sadducees, who are a bit more the established, possibly priestly group. I mean, there's some discussion about whether that's true, but they're a bit more established. They tend to like the status quo. But then you've got the Pharisees party that don't like the status quo. But I think it's fair to say that no one wants to stir up too much trouble at this point. And leading so they're being very careful.
And leading into that kind of factions, of course, a little before Jesus, I think 37, 40 odd years before, there's this uprising of Jewish, in a sense, rebellion where, we shouldn't be paying taxes to the Romans, and this whole kind of, was it Judas?
Judas the Galilean,
Judas the Galilean. And here's Jesus from Galilee, and it's like, let's see if we can put that guy in that bucket. And so there's a whole lot of this stuff in the mix that we probably don't fully understand.
Well, that would be a convenient way of dismissing Jesus. Well, not just dismissing him, but actually potentially handing him over to the Romans as a potentially one of these sort of guys. So that would be a convenient way to get rid of Jesus. Either that, or because for Jewish people there is something problematic about paying taxes to Caesar. So this is the question that we come to today, which is they pull out a pretty big gun here in terms of confronting Jesus. So Jesus is in public.
Yeah.
And
so in Matthew chapter 22, we just jumped into Matthew 22 at the end of our last episode. So we covered the banquet, and we're now at verse 15 of Matthew 22, listeners, so you can figure out where we're up to here.
So that's right. And it's introduced in verse 15 of chapter 22, then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words.
Yes.
And this is where they bring this question, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Okay, so the question is important, is it lawful? And they mean by the Mosaic law. Now, they know if he says, no, it's not, well, they can hand him over to the Romans and conveniently get rid of him that way.
And he's the same as Judas the Galilean.
That's right.
He's in that mob.
Now, even though they would probably side with that in some sense, but still it's a convenient way of serving their purpose. If he says it is lawful, then he's really going against probably the large weight, the mood of the times, which is this sort of anti-Roman thing, and he can be dismissed as a conspirator with the Romans, right? So, so this is, they think that they're going to entangle him. So he is famously brilliant. Reply, and it's not just a way. It's interesting. It's not just a way of avoiding the issue. He is actually, because he says, "Show me a coin," and so they pull out. These Pharisees, they pull out a coin and they show him the coin. And he says, whose likeness and inscription is this? And they say Caesar's. And he says to them, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, okay? So we might see that at one level as just a way of avoiding the issue, but it's actually more clever than that. Because first of all, he asks them to hand him a denarii.
Which they shouldn't be carrying anyway.
Which they shouldn't be carrying anyway, right?
As a patriotic Jew, it was not appropriate to be carrying a Roman coin. Yep.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, they're being used. These Roman coins are being actually used in the temple, and everyone seems to be fine with that. So essentially, by getting them to produce a Roman coin with the image of Caesar on it, and of course for Jewish people, you don't depict images of any human being on anything because of the association with idolatry. Not only that, but there's also not only is the head of Caesar on the coins, but they're conscious of the fact that Caesar is claiming this kind of semi-divine status. In fact, around the edge of the coin, it says, son of a god, essentially. So there's the claim that this is the son of God, Caesar, and so it's making these blasphemous claims. And this is what's clever about his response. So first of all, he exposes the hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders. So they've got this in their possession. They're trading in these coins in the temple courts. So there's idolatry in the temple courts. But Jesus is essentially, he's not just exposing that, because they wouldn't have seen themselves as idolatrous in that sense, but they are wanting to use the weapons of Caesar against Caesar in a sense. And so he, in another sense, he is exposing the idolatry of their sort of nationalism and the way that they want to establish that as well. And so there's a kind of doubly revolutionary twist here, because he's saying, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but also give to God what is God's, right? Which is worship. And that's it's an allusion to Psalm 96, ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name. And it's interesting too, because there's a statement by Mattathias Maccabee going back to the Maccabees, where he talks about paying back the occupiers,
right.
Let's pay them back, right? Give unto them. It's that retribution. And there's a slight echo of that. Give to Caesar what's due to him, right? Because in a way, Jesus is countering the claim of Caesar to be the Son of God, right?
Yes.
Not in terms of worldly weapons. This is not a worldly revolution. And then again, over and against the Pharisees, give to God's what is God's, having produced this essentially idolatrous, image. So it's very clever the way that he's exposing their hypocrisy. And hypocrisy, of course, is a big theme in his denunciation of the religious leaders.
And it's a double whammy for them because, one, they don't really want to pay the taxes, but they also don't want to render unto God that which is God's.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's like, either way, you guys lose in this argument.
Yeah, that's right.
Very clear.
Yeah, so it's brilliant. So then the Sadducees come to him. So the Sadducees are another group. Again, it's a little complex, the different groupings, and it's not actually always easy to identify exactly the nature of these groupings. The Sadducees have been associated with the priestly class, and that, I think, is possible. I think that's perhaps even likely, although they are often referred to like priests and Sadducees. So for some reason, they're often like a separate group. In fact, the name Sadducees may come from the name Zadok, who was a priest and through whom the ideal priesthood was to be reckoned through this Zadok, who was in the time of David. Anyway, point is that the Sadducees were a kind of one of these other groups. They held only to the books of Moses.
So they were the non-political faction of the religious leadership, were they, for the Jews? Whereas the Pharisees tended to be a bit more sort of like the local council.
Oh, yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So, no, they were all involved in the leadership. So they're all part of the Sanhedrin.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So they're all part of this group that's, sort of leads the people. The Sadducees probably are your non-revolutionary group. They probably like the status quo, whereas the Pharisees are moving towards, the Zealots are the extreme revolutionaries. The Pharisaic party would be sort of moderate. Right. They don't like the Roman occupation. Quite probably, if the Sadducees are to be associated with a priestly class, then they probably, remember the status quo is giving them power in a sense. So they don't acknowledge, according to the Sadducees, and this is different to the Pharisees, they believe that when you die, your soul dies with the body. So they do believe in a soul, but they believe that the soul dies with the body, and then that's it, right?
Yep.
So
that's because they only really hold to the Torah.
Yeah, that's right.
The 5 books, and there's no mention of resurrection.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so they don't believe in a physical resurrection. So they come to Jesus with this, law of Moses having to do with marriage. A man, in order to preserve the family name, a widow goes through the brothers, in other words. And the question is, okay, so who is she lawfully married to? Like, she's married all of these brothers, in heaven. Who is she lawfully, married to in the resurrection? It's their way of discounting the resurrection,
How can this possibly work? Come on, let's see.
Look, I mean, they're trying to draw him into this debate. They're trying to draw him into these theological debates, and he simply says, look, you've completely missed the whole point of everything. In the resurrection, it's not going to, we're not going to be like we are now. There's not going to be the same sort of level that, the same. I mean, he doesn't give us a lot of information here.
There's not going to be gradients of love.
That's a great way to put it.
There's going to be only perfect love. So you can't have someone you love less or someone you love more.
Exactly.
We love everyone. So,
that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So that's essentially what he points to in that instance. So again, it's another instance of where he, without getting too drawn into all the theological issues, he's able to not just dismiss the issue, but put the issue to bed and move on. So that's essentially what he does. But then he's asked the more important question by a Pharisee, and this is amongst all of the rabbis. There were all these debates about which laws are greater than others, because it was understood that.
And we're talking about essentially the 10 Commandments here, or are we talking broader than that?
No, broader than that, actually. There was,
screeds of laws.
There were hundreds of laws. And so a lot of the rabbinic discussion revolved around the fact that in certain situations, in order to keep one law, you might have to break another law. What if on the Sabbath your sheep falls into a hole? Are you allowed to rescue?
Right.
You know what I mean? So one law might contravene potentially another law. So there was a lot of discussions about this, and so then it led to a sort of a grading of the different laws. So they're very interested in, where is he at in terms of the most important.
So you think this is a more genuine question, or do you think this is still a question trying to get him to pick something that they can then use to?
Yeah, I think this is they're still trying to catch him out with something. In a way, I mean, this one might be just more a matter of interest, but we already know that they're against him, so there's malice here. He's asked the question, which is the greatest commandment? Famously, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind and strength in Mark. And then the second is love your neighbor as yourself. And so all of the law and the prophets depend on these things. And of course, for Jesus, this is important too, because in a sense they're not really holding. One of his criticisms of them is that they are ticking boxes. They're offering God this sort of lip service, ticking boxes. They're not really. They're following laws. They're not giving their heart. And so this quote from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and then from Leviticus, you should love your neighbor as yourself.
19,
Yep. This is a subtle rebuke to them.
Yeah. And I think a good point you made there, that the Jewish law had become so much about ticking boxes that it wasn't actually about searching your heart or your conscience. It was simply, what does the rule book say? Tick, 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 and then going away feeling happy with yourself. And what Jesus is trying to say here, actually, you know what? And he's been trying to say through most of the parables that we've heard, it's the underlying motive, it's the underlying heart. And so he ties these two things together, one with our, first of all, our love with God about a heart decision, and then our love and care for others about a heart decision, which is so completely counter the law as they were upholding it.
And then yet another debate. It's interesting to picture this, that he's with these religious leaders and they're hitting him with a lot of the big controversial questions, right? And I mean, this is an interesting tactic on their part, because he is getting to the heart, right?
Yeah.
And I think they're feeling in this sort of prophetic role that he's exposing things in their heart. So what's a good way to deflect is to draw away to theoretical, complex discussions.
Yeah.
This is, Stu, I think we've always got to watch out for this, to think that we're, an expression of our devotedness is to get caught up in all sorts of complex theoretical issues, like, end time stuff and world watching, and we're scouring the scriptures about end time stuff, and it all becomes a bit of avoidance of God is really trying to expose in our hearts, and we're just getting caught up in all of these sort of theoretical, controversial issues.
And even more so as well, the mission of God. Meantime, people are going to hell while we're busy trying to find the answer to what's going to happen on the last day, which Jesus says himself, no one knows.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway. it's not that he thinks that these questions are unimportant.
No,
it's just that they're constantly deflecting.
It's the motive.
They're constantly deflecting attention and from themselves. Now, this is good. I mean, he's going to get to the heart, right, in the next chapter, right? Does. He's just going to go for it.
Yep.
He's going to let them deflect. He's going to answer their questions, but he's going to get to the heart in a moment. So the final one is this discussion about, whose son is the Christ. Of course, the traditional view is that he is, of course, the son of David, right?
Yep.
When Jesus came into Jerusalem, Hosanna to the Son of David. They would have heard people declaring this. Well, whose son is the Christ? They said to him, the Son of David. And
he asks him then, he says, how is it then that David, inspired by the Spirit, calls him Lord?
Yeah.
The Lord declared to my Lord, this is the quote, which is, I think, from Psalm 110. Yes, the Lord declared to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. So then Jesus goes on to say, if David calls him Lord, how then can he be his son?
It's interesting the way that he answers this question, because he's not denying that the Messiah is of Davidic lineage. And of course, there are, debates, of course, because one of the things is that the Davidic line had been cut off, and you had the Maccabees and all of these sort of things. So there's some debate about messianic lineage. So Jesus isn't denying that as such. I mean, we've got to remember that for Matthew, Jesus' Davidic lineage is actually very important.
Yes.
He begins with a genealogy at the start of his gospel.
Yeah, that's right.
So essentially he's saying, yes, he is that, but he's much more than that. That's the point of this. Yeah. So he says, if David calls him Lord, how is he his son? Or in other words, only his son, right? And of course, what Matthew points out is that, well, he is ultimately the Son of God because he's been conceived by the Holy Spirit. That in Matthew's gospel, that's very important. But he still has this Davidic lineage. So it's kind of both, but this is emphasizing the fact that he's actually much greater than just a Davidic king. So he's striking here at the fact that this isn't not just a political king like David.
Yes.
Right. This is actually much more. The Christ is going to be much more than that. And that's actually what they're not quite getting.
And of course, he out-academicked them. And at this point, they decided we ain't going to ask any more questions because actually we're probably looking more foolish in front of everybody than we thought. So that was the end of it. But obviously, he'd spiked a fair bit of anger within them, I would imagine. And now they're really
imagine they're all gathered around, and then he turns to his disciples, probably in their hearing.
Yeah, totally.
And he says to the crowds, okay, so he's saying this. I mean, this is huge. He's saying to the crowds and his disciples, with them there, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do not.
So it says, do whatever they tell you, but and observe it, but don't do what they do because they don't practice what they teach.
And he just goes at them. They are hypocrites.
Yeah, totally.
He just exposes their hypocrisy. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. They wear these phylacteries, which are these boxes on their head with, sections of the law of Moses in it. It's taking literally what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 6 about binding the law of God to your forehead. I mean, it's meant to be a sort of metaphorical thing there, but they literally do this, right? And they make it really obvious that they're doing it. So it's really this outward stuff. They they wear these robes with the fringes extra long. So look how extra godly we are. Yep. They love to be called rabbi and be greeted in the marketplace. It's all ego. They are whitewashed tombs. I mean, he repeats throughout this section the things that he calls them. Hypocrites throughout this. That's the biggest one.
And scribes and Pharisees. It seems like he's not addressing the Sadducees here. It would seem, but
yeah, that's right.
They're within hearing anyway. But he says 7 times, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites."
Yeah, that's right. And he calls them blind guides. Blind is another way that he refers to them. Because they're the ones that are meant to be guiding the people. I mean, he says you impose these burdens on the people that you yourselves can't even carry, right?
Yeah, would choose not to.
You know, and so he's holding them accountable for this. You know, I mean, part of their hypocrisy, I mean, there's that famous statement where he says, you strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel, right? Yeah. You go for the details of the law, but you
miss the big picture.
You miss the big picture. And he's just said that, you know, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, if we cross-reference to Luke's gospel, that's also the context, and Matthew doesn't have this, but the story of the Good Samaritan, which is basically designed to show that they don't, you know, they're not really keeping that law, essentially.
And then towards the end of that,
you're the same as those who murdered the prophets and so forth.
Well, I was just going to say that last one before he goes, snakes, brood of vipers. Boy, that's strong. He says, you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we wouldn't have taken part with them in shedding the prophet's blood, and yet that's exactly what they're about to do. With this final prophet of God.
Exactly.
Phenomenal.
So through this chapter, through chapter 23, there are exactly 7 woes. You know, woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. This is about as serious a denunciation as you can imagine. I mean, he is bringing judgment down upon them, consigning them to hell pretty much. You know, and this is, I mean, it's really serious stuff, Stuart. It's like, I mean, I think, you know, it's interesting that throughout Matthew's gospel, he's willing to be friends of tax collectors, of prostitutes, of sinners, anyone who will but admit their imperfection and their need for mercy. There is not a hesitation. But if you think you're righteous and you ride the high horse, so to speak, and you think you're better than other, and you take the position of judge, you know, and you ascribe to this box-ticking religion and, you know, wear that status because of that, that is the most dangerous position of all. So it's hypocrisy that Jesus hates. It's the righteous overlay, the righteous veneer over, you know, as he says, whitewashed tombs. You know,
truly,
it's pretty
I tell
sobering
you, all
stuff.
these things will come on this generation as he's worked through.
That's right.
All of that. Which is going to be important as we move on.
Which is going to happen within a generation, within 40 years, and he's going to say that again in Matthew chapter 24.
Because we're at about 30 AD at this point.
Yeah, that's right. And in 70 AD, the city is going to be completely destroyed.
And the temple.
Absolutely. And that is actually catastrophic. I mean, that is enormous, absolute catastrophe for the Jewish people. I mean, and between that and even, there's going to be a few smaller revolts after that, but pretty much they're going to be cast out of the land. I mean, essentially until 1948, you know, really.
That's right.
So it's actually a catastrophe that's about to happen, and he is, you know, foreshadowing this here. So,
of course, he states that then in the last part of chapter 23, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
So, the desolation of the house, it's, you know, it's coming. And the next, the very next thing that happens, you know, they're walking through the temple, and the disciples point out to him the buildings of the temple, and other gospels say would you look at these stones, and isn't this wonderful? And in other words, essentially they're saying, surely not, like how can you be against?
Do you reckon? I don't know that they're even getting it yet still, to be honest. I just wonder whether they're just trying to, he's in a bit of a bad mood, let's cheer him up a bit. You know, look at the view, isn't this? Well, I don't know. It feels to me like they still haven't really grasped fully what he's saying about his death.
No doubt.
Anyway.
I think that's true. I mean, some of the commentary I read on their remarks, I think the best guess was from some of the commentators was that they are trying to sort of alleviate the tension, because he's like, essentially, you know, he said your house is going to be left to you desolate. Like he's declared this judgment upon Jerusalem in prophetic manner, and that, you know, with their background, that can only mean one thing, right? Totally. That is the destruction of the city. So they're thinking, surely that could never happen, right?
Yeah.
Surely it could never happen. And so they go up to the Mount of Olives, which actually overlooks. It's the classic vantage point that looks over Jerusalem.
And you've been there, Matt.
Yeah, that's right. And number of times. In fact, when I go there, I'll often go out early morning at sunrise on my own and go up and sit and look over the city. And I often think of this, because you look down upon, the city today, and I mean, it's, you've got the Al-Aqsa Mosque there, and you've got the Dome of the Rock, and, it's in some ways there's such an element of tragedy to that, in a sense. And they're sitting up at that vantage point. They're looking over Jerusalem, and this is often called the Olivet Discourse. Olivet Discourse, yeah.
So just if you've heard that term before, this is what that's referring to.
So they're looking over the city, and he's just said to them, when they say this thing about the stones, he says to them, and this would have been a shock to them, you see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be one stone left upon another that will not be thrown down. I mean, you can actually, even today, you can go there to around where the city walls were, and you can still, the stones thrown down are still there.
Yeah.
Actually, these massive stones that still there.
Wow.
This is massive for them, right? For them, that's the end of the world. Like really, for them, that's the end of if that happens, it's the ultimate judgment now. This is that has to be the final sort of day of judgment, right? The end of the age. So they come to him privately and they say, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming? And the word there is parousia, so his coming in judgment.
And of the end of the age.
And of the end of the age, right.
Now, I think important, there's two separate questions there I think Jesus answers separately. And we too often, I think this is a passage of scripture that's over-interpreted, in my opinion. Anyway. And I'm sure you're going to correct me there, but I feel like there's two separate questions and Jesus answers them quite separately.
Yeah. It's very common for Christians to fall into the very mistake that Jesus is trying to correct, right? So first of all, the two aspects of that question are, when will these things be?
So those are all the things he's just talked about that's going to happen within
the destruction of Jerusalem.
Within 40 years, the destruction of Jerusalem at AD 70.
Yeah, all this, this will come, upon this generation, right? One stone left upon another. Okay, so when will these things be? But see, in their heads, because they assume that's the end.
Can't be anything worse than that. Yeah, exactly.
That's the end of the world, right? So they say, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age, right?
Because they think those two things have to happen.
They have to happen together.
Yeah.
So Jesus is essentially says, now just watch out now, right? He's correcting this misconception, which is why he says, see that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray, right? Which was true around this time within Jerusalem. The messianic pretenders, there were lots of messianic pretenders, lots of people trying to mislead the people, saying this is the moment. During the Jewish wars in the lead up to the destruction of the temple, this was really, accelerated. And so...
And in fact, caused a lot of infighting amongst the Jews.
Lots of infighting.
In fact, they probably killed more of each other than
they did. In the end, I'll talk about that in a moment. Cool. So he's just saying, listen, watch out, because there are people going to say, this moment, this is our moment, this is the end of the age, this is and just don't be deceived, right? And he goes on to say, you will hear of wars, rumors of wars. Now, wars and rumors of wars, because the Romans are going to be at war in the east as well, and they're going to think, oh, this is a good time to rise up against the Romans, and so wars and rumors of wars.
Yep.
And he says, see that you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet.
Yep.
Now, it's interesting that, like, I've often heard Christians say, oh, no, it must be the end because there are wars and rumors of wars, right? So that means it's the end. No. He's saying these things are just part of this age, right?
Yeah.
Of this turbulent age, but it doesn't mean that it's the end, right? It's just it's part. And he goes on to say, he says, for nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pains.
Yeah.
So what Jesus is saying is that, and he's essentially predicting a long period of time in which all of these things, it's an age characterized by all of these things, right? There are going to be wars and all sorts of things.
In a particular
That's right.
Correct.
And all of this is part of the movement towards, because the next great prophetic event beyond that will be the second coming of Christ and the day of judgment. But there are essentially two events here. And again, this is in the question. There's the destruction of Jerusalem. That's the first part of their question. When will these things happen? Because he's referred to the destruction of Jerusalem. Then there's the question about his coming, his parousia.
Yes.
Okay, he's coming in judgment to finally destroy all evil, right? And those two things, he's separated those two things, right? He's separating those two things. There's going to be an age in between. But in a sense, the fulfillment of the one is in some sense a sign of a movement towards the other.
So it's pointing towards it. But
that's right, yeah. So when the destruction of Jerusalem happens and when this is fulfilled, and he even gives the time, because they've said, when will these things happen? Now, he's going to tell them
exactly when it's going to happen.
Exactly. It's going to happen within this generation, he says a bit further on, which means 40 years, and it happens exactly
in 40 years.
In 40 years' time. But he says, actually, but about the coming of the Son of Man, the parousia, no one knows that, right?
Yes.
No one knows that. So he's
Except
separating these two things.
Totally.
Okay. So I think that's important to understand that separation. So he goes on to talk about this particular period that he's talking about. It says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation, put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my sake. Then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. This is still within the Jewish wars and leading up to many false prophets will arise and lead many astray, because lawlessness will be increased. The love of many will grow cold. I mean, the accounts of the Jewish wars were, there was absolute slaughter within the walls of Jerusalem. Josephus, says that more Jews killed other Jews at this time than
Josephus is a well-known
the Romans did.
Jewish historian.
That's right.
Who wrote a lot of commentary on the times.
That's right. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. Then the end will come. So these events are going to happen, right? That'll precipitate a kind of shift, right? And this age is all about the gospel going out to the nations, right? That's what this age is all about. Yep. Now, one of the reasons he's saying all of this is that he wants to say to them, listen, don't get distracted, right?
Yeah.
Don't get distracted from the job, because people are going to try and draw you into these false messianic movements. They're going to try and draw you into all these conspiracies and all these different things. You're going to get distracted by looking, for signs and wars and like being kind of world watchers and, watching endless YouTube clips about, things that are happening in the world and
how that aligns with this.
And how that aligns with that, and speculating about, is this the end of and he's saying, no, don't do that. Keep to the job, right? Focus on the job.
And the fact of, I just want to come back, and you're probably going to cover this a little later as well. When he says these are birth pains, there isn't an end of the world. There's a new world.
That's right. Yeah.
And so we keep using this language, then the end of the world will come. He doesn't say then the end of the world will come. He just says then the end will come of this tribulation.
Yeah.
And the birth pains means it's birthing something new, not it's destroying.
Yeah, that's right. Because Jesus is gonna usher in a new order. Yeah, that's right.
So he talks about the abomination of the desolation.
Yeah. So he says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel, so this kind of thing, shockingly for them, this kind of thing is going to happen, right? Standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. In other words, it's going to be, there's something like this is going to happen. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, this did happen, and shockingly, initially, actually, it was the Jewish zealots that desecrated the holy place in the temple by making it into a fortress. This is something Josephus, the Jewish historian that you mentioned, he believed that the final destruction of Jerusalem happened because of the desecration of the temple by the zealots, because they made it into a fortress from which they killed their brothers, within Jerusalem. They mounted war on another faction. So it's interesting that, but of course, it was then trampled by the Romans, and they brought all their Roman standards and trampled this holy place. So absolutely, this did happen, and this is meant to be, once this starts happening, this is meant to be a sign, get out, just get out of the city. And actually,
and we're still in the AD 70 kind of area.
We're still in the lead up to AD 70.
That's right.
Now, interestingly, the Christians who were in Jerusalem, because of actually this oracle, when these things started to happen, they actually did get out of the city, and so they were spared because of these things. So he says, then let those who are in Judea flee them out. So let no one who's on the rooftop, go attack one who's in it. Just get out, right? He's saying you've got to get, as soon as you see this happen. And in fact, I think in Luke, he says, as soon as you see the armies approaching, the Roman armies, just get out, right? This is pre-warning, which
you're not going to win
they
there.
do.
Yep, that's right.
In fact, in Luke's gospel, it's even more plain that he's talking here about the events leading up to 70 AD. So, let no one who is in the field turn back to get his cloak. But alas, for women who are pregnant, for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until never again will be, which is a classic sort of prophetic step. Like this is going to be really, really bad, right?
This is going to be very bad.
Yeah. I mean, because of, like, some people conflate this with a final tribulation, which there may be a double reference here. And this is where I think we can possibly allow for that. I just think we need to be careful, because Jesus actually is, and a lot of evangelical commentators today, some of the most prominent New Testament scholars, are going to insist that actually, no, Jesus is using classic prophetic language. This is the kind of language that the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah used about the destruction of Babylon, international upheaval, the initial destruction of Jerusalem, in 586 BC, back in their time. This is that sort of prophetic language. So, they would still insist, no, he's still actually talking about the events leading up to 70 AD. I think, however, it's possible that he could be moving into a double reference to both this tribulation and a sort of final tribulation, with seeing the one, in a sense, as a prefiguration of the other, potentially allow for that.
But he does say that even through all of this, this, again, leading up to AD 70, God's still going to step in a sense, and cut the days short.
Yeah, that's right.
So that those who... Interesting that it uses the word... What's the Greek word that's actually used there for elect? It's the first time I've seen that word used in Matthew's gospel. In my translation, it says, but those days will be cut short because of the elect.
Our English word comes from a Greek word, electos. So
it's chosen?
Yeah, it's grounded in Old Testament theology, this sense that Israel are the
chosen.
Yeah, are the elect of God. But the interesting thing that in the development of Old Testament theology and through the prophets, there's always this redefinition of who actually really does belong to the people of God, and it's constantly being refined. This is what is referred to as remnant theology. So there's this sense, the remnant of God's people. Jesus essentially sees his disciples as being the true remnant of God's people, and so this is what he's saying: for the sake of the elect, those will be cut short. So it's grounded in that idea of the people of the true.
So he then goes on to say, if anyone tells you, then see, here is the Messiah, or over here, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders to lead astray. And of course, that happened.
It happens
after all of this, and it continues to happen.
That's right. Which is why he goes on to say, look, when he comes, everyone will know, right? It's like, because he says, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Like it's going to be really plain, right? So there won't be any doubt. Okay. Everyone will just know, right?
And the last thing, the 28, wherever the carcass is, there the vultures will gather. I don't know if you ever remember watching those old Western movies, and if they wanted to kind of give you a premonition that someone had died, you'd look up in the sky and you'd go, oh,
that's right,
that died. So it's like wherever you are, you'll know that this has happened.
Yeah. So he goes on to say, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Yep. And again, this is standard prophetic language here. It's, in fact, Isaiah uses the same sort of language about, the destruction of, in Isaiah 13 and then into 14, again, Ezekiel chapter 32, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. This is standard prophetic language. So in Isaiah 13 and 14, it's used to describe the fall of Babylon.
Right.
This is a standard prophetic way of referring to international upheaval. It's not referring to the fact that the universe is going to fall apart.
It was just their way of describing something.
Yeah.
You know, and it's something that big. It was the only way they could really put language around it, really, wasn't it?
Well, and actually, you know, Jesus is deliberately reflecting the language that Isaiah used of the fall of Babylon.
Yeah.
In other words, to say that this is going to happen again, but it's actually going to happen to you, right? So he's using these standard prophetic ways of describing international upheaval in this
which means nations will fall, all the wars, the whole world's going to be in turmoil, the known world at the time.
It says, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and the tribes of the earth will mourn. Now, it's interesting, Josephus records that there were these signs, which is a big deal for ancient peoples, with things in the sky. We're not exactly sure whether it was a comet or some kind of there was some kind of, whether it's astrological or otherwise, these signs actually over during the Jewish wars, which were noted by everyone actually.
And they would have seen that as a star falling from the sky, essentially.
Well,
potentially,
and they certainly would have seen that as a sign of as a sign of something.
To this,
they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. This is another standard way of like Psalm 68. You know, the Son of Man, coming. It actually talks about Yahweh coming on the clouds to defeat his enemies. It's a standard way of referring, and this is actually referring to the Son of Man coming on the clouds as an allusion to Daniel chapter 7,
right?
Where he goes and is seated at the right hand of God the Father.
So it's not coming back; it's actually coming to his rightful place.
That's right. Yeah. So now, of course, the fulfillment of that, and the word here isn't parousia, by the way. The coming in the clouds is the word erchomai, and so a different word to parousia. So this is not Jesus coming to earth. This is Jesus going and being seated at the right hand of God the Father, and we referred to Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet, right?
Yeah, right. So
the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven is all about defeating his enemies, being seated at the right hand of God until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet.
So this is essentially the death and resurrection of Christ, who will then go and sit at the right hand of Christ.
Yeah, that's right. So he ascends to the right hand of God the Father, from where he defeats his enemies. Now, the sad thing about this is that his enemies, in this case, is Jerusalem that has set itself against him. Yeah. I mean, this is the tragic thing about this.
So then he goes on to say, he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. And that's kind of what's happening now, isn't it?
That's what's happening now. That's right. So as he said, these things are going to happen. He said this before, these things are going to happen, and the end will not come until the gospel has gone out to the end of the world.
Yeah, well, we're about to read in the next one. He then does the parable of the fig tree.
Yeah.
Learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its branches become tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near at the door. So we're talking about all the things he's just explained in relating to the imminent future. I tell you, and then he actually reaffirms the timeline. I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place.
Yeah. So he's basically said,
there's a set time.
There's a set time. Yep. These things are going to happen within this generation, which is, I think it's important to read. That's why it's important to read everything up until now did actually take place. I mean, we know this as a historical fact. All of these things happened in
AD 70.
In AD 70, right?
And soon after. Yep.
Just as he said, it's exactly as he prophesied. Yep. Because now he's going to go on and say, but concerning that day or hour, and he's talking about the end of the age now, no one knows.
Yeah, so the interesting thing to me, and I'm no Bible theologian, and you are, Matt, as you said, you've studied the Bible in Hebrew and Greek. I've studied the Bible in multiple languages too, NIV, NLT, CSB. But anyway, I feel like that last verse 35, actually should be at the start of the next group, because it's like he's now moving on to the next thing. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Yeah. Now, concerning that day being when heaven and earth will pass away.
Yeah.
But it's kind of at the end of the other one, which I think that creates a bit of
So the heaven and earth thing pass away, by the way, this is not, we've just got to be careful because, the West is quite influenced by the sort of Platonic Greek tradition, which teaches there's going to be an end of the world. And that sort of language never meant, it meant that the present state of things is going to pass away, because it repeats that statement in Revelation chapter 21, for the old order of things has passed away, it says. So that's what passes away. In Revelation 21, it makes very explicit what this means. It refers to the old order of things, replaced by a situation when basically heaven comes down to earth and God dwells among human beings on a sort of new heavenly earth in resurrection bodies. So this is not the final destruction of all physical sort of reality. It's the destruction of the old order of things, okay? Right. So, and that's going to happen. And when that happens, no one knows that.
Yeah.
Right?
So now he's answering the second question they asked together that everyone we tend to conflate, but this is the second question. So now he's going, now concerning your second question, essentially, that day, in other words, when is the end of the world coming, or whatever terminology you want to give that, now concerning that day, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, except the Father alone. So if you take Jesus at his word, no one knows.
That's right, no one knows. And don't try and work it out.
Exactly, because then someone knows, and Jesus is wrong. No one knows.
That's right.
Anyway.
That's right. Now one of the, and I think this is worth saying, Stu, that a lot of interpreters of Matthew chapter 24 do get caught up in the language of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and just automatically assume, well, that's the end time. That's where this becomes tricky. And so, which then it becomes tricky to interpret, this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. And, they say, because, this generation, they say, oh, that could be translated as this race will not pass. And like, it just doesn't have that interpretation, doesn't have any support in it's, he's clearly telling them when these things are going to happen to separate those events.
That's right.
From, to answer. And, this is part of his caution with his disciples. Yeah. However, I think it's also important to allow for some measure of
alluding to the future.
Yeah, of alluding to the future through these things, because this is often what happens in prophetic literature, is that they predict something, and the thing that they predict, in a sense, becomes a prefigurement of something longer term. So it is actually true that Jesus is going to come on the clouds of heaven, and he is going to defeat his enemies, and there is going to be international all of these things, including tribulation, and these things will actually take place at the end as well. But the point here is that what happened in the lead up to 70 AD acts as a kind of prefigurement of that, but a confirmation that it's going to happen in a bigger and more important way at the end as well. Yeah. So I think you can take this as an allusion to an event beyond
that's going to happen in the future.
The destruction of Jerusalem around 70 AD. But I think you still really need to take this in the context of what Jesus is saying. And he's saying, listen, all these things are going to happen. That means we should actually take seriously the fact that, look, when that did happen, it's like, oh, okay.
Jesus was right.
He was right.
Which means he's probably right about everything else.
Exactly. And the point is that, okay, yes, these initial things are going to happen, but that's not even the ultimate fulfillment, in a sense. It's not the ultimate fulfillment of the predictions of God judging and doing all of these things. That's still, that's still.
And if you think about the bigger picture story, originally the Jewish people were meant to be the redemptive light for the world.
Yeah.
They failed and were destroyed. And so now Jesus has started with everyone, the Jews, Gentiles, the Jews, to be the redemptive light. And there's a journey where he's going to allow us as the church to be his servants on earth. But there's going to come a point where everyone's had the chance to repent and accept Jesus at that point. That's right. Time's up.
So in terms of the parable of the wedding feast that we've seen for Matthew chapter 22 at the beginning of 22, in this age, everyone gets invited to the wedding feast, and when all the places are taken, then the end comes. In a sense, there's that sense that you get. The important thing from here on in Matthew, at the end of Matthew chapter 24 and chapter 25, this is now all about not being distracted and getting on with the job. This is so important, right? Because we do the opposite often. And so ironically, often because we get caught up in all of this theoretical end time stuff, right? And we become world watchers, and we're looking at what's happening in Israel and what's happening in Russia and what's happening here, and we're listening to these people that think that they have all the answers and that think that they know when it's, this is
even though Jesus didn't. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, and we get so distracted with this stuff. It's essentially like, he says, we need to be sober-minded and alert. He goes on to stress the importance of that in the last part of this chapter, because he says you don't want this to come upon you when you're not ready. It'll be like a servant whose master goes on a long journey and comes back, and he just relaxes and he's fiddling around, wasting time and mistreating other arguing with fellow servants about, their eschatological views. And I'm emphasizing that, but it's like completely distracted from the job that you were left to do, which is about taking the message to the nations, right? And the next sort of group of teaching is all about readiness, the importance of readiness in the famous parable of the 10 virgins, which has this scenario of a wedding feast where attendants, essentially they're attendants, and we don't know much about wedding ceremonies at this stage, but it seems that what's happening here is that there were attendants who would wait for the groom as he was coming back from the bride's house. So the wedding has happened, and then there's the wedding feast,
right? And
he would come back, but the main event, of course, is the wedding feast.
Yes.
And the tragedy here is that once the groom comes back, the attendants meet him, and then they come back with him into the wedding feast, and the door's shut. And if you're not ready, and it's not actually just because you fall asleep, it's because you're not
prepared.
And the example is used here as being the preparedness, right? Their lamps ran out of oil.
They didn't take extra oil. They just took enough to fill the lamp.
Yeah.
The other half of the virgins took extra oil because they weren't going to assume that they knew when the groom was going to come. They were going to maybe have a backup plan just in case he was running late.
Exactly.
And sure enough, he was. And
that's right. And again, we with the interpretation of parables, we don't need to go on what does the oil stand for specifically. This is it making one point, and it's about just be ready. Focus on the main thing, right? Focus on the main thing. Otherwise, you'll be found unready and you'll be shut out from the main event. I mean, it's quite chilling because, the virgins who are distracted essentially and not on the job, they're saying, well, hang on, whoa,
what about us?
What about us? I don't know you, right?
I see this one, and then we'll talk about the parable of the talents, and then I think we're done for this episode. But I think the first one is really talking about our personal preparedness in our hearts to welcome Jesus when he comes back. The second one is talking about what we're meant to be doing with our time while we're waiting.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's interesting, actually, the word talent, when we talk about our talents actually comes from this. I think it's the point that this parable is making is God has given to each person He's equipped them with a task, with an assignment. We're not all meant to do everything. This is saying the opposite to we all need to go off and amass spiritual achievements so that we can feel that we're ready, right? No. All you have to do is what you've been specifically assigned to do.
What have you got in your hands?
To some little, to some much.
Yeah,
right,
probably.
Exactly. What have you got in your hand? What are you doing with it? In some ways, it's very simple. He's just asking us to be faithful with the things that we've been given for his mission in this age. That's the thing that we're meant to be focusing on. So that's what the parable of the talents is about. It's like this master that gives sums of money and they're meant to bring that to profit according to what they've been given, right? But one of them just buries it in a hole and just bunkers down essentially, right? And this is the problem when we get distracted with things. We just we're just bunkering down and waiting for Jesus to come. No, don't do that. Just get on with the job.
And I think there's a bit of a lesson here for us as the church today, in that we can get busy about a whole lot of things that aren't the Great Commandment and the Great Commission and think we're doing good things. We've done this and we're doing that. And I feel like Jesus is going to say, but what did I actually ask you to do? Make disciples, And I think we can sometimes, again, be distracted into all these other things that aren't bad in themselves. They aren't the main thing that Jesus wanted us to do when he left and said, I'm coming back.
And then the final scene is this famous judgment scene where he gets right to the heart of it. He says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. This is now the end.
Well, he's answering, remember again, we're now answering the second half of the question, which started a little bit earlier as well.
Yeah.
So this is still now answering the second half of that question.
That's
when
right.
Jesus actually does come again.
So this is your classic judgment scene. It's interesting because in the Old Testament prophecies, it's always Yahweh that comes and seated on his throne and divides the nations and so forth. Here, it's Christ that's doing this. He is the divine judge in that sense. So that's an interesting connection there. And then, of course, the basis of all judgment, and this goes right back to the Old Testament, is that according to what you have done, each person is rewarded according to what they have done. Now, this can be problematic for particularly. If we think in the light of Pauline theology that it's by faith. Now, this is not saying that these people were accepted into God's kingdom because they did things. What they did was evidence of the faith. As James says, faith is accompanied with evidence. Like it's a certain, faith means that your life is entrusted to God and his purpose. That is what faith actually means. It's not just believing that something is true. It's entrusting your life to it. And
therefore that changes your behavior.
That's right. So the point of this is it's meant to be, this is meant to be a tool of self-examination. It's not telling us how we're saved. It's giving us criteria by which we can actually be awakened, because he says, be sober-minded and alert, right? This is meant to awaken us. Oh, hang on. Am I getting caught up in other things and not actually about the mission of Jesus here? It's interesting here that he says, this is the famous thing that he says to the righteous, come, enter into glory. Because I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was stranger, you welcomed me. I was naked, clothed. I was sick, you visited me. I was in prison, you came to me. And they say, when did we do this? And he famously says, what you did to the least. And it's interesting, to the least of these, because throughout the Gospels, the least of these refers to his disciples. So in
the
a sense,
of the followers of Christ.
And I think in some ways this sort of goes back to the Abrahamic idea of those who bless you will be blessed and those who curse you will be cursed. So there's an interesting connection with that. It's almost like how you treated my emissaries.
The people that represented me.
The people that represented me will determine your fate, which connects with that Abrahamic promise, in a sense, because, and again, it's based, I'm basing this on this idea of what you did to one of the least of these, my brothers. Now,
but also Jesus, who was an emissary.
Yeah, that's right.
What you did with Jesus.
Yeah.
What he's given you.
So I think that aspect is there. One very prominent commentary just cautioned against narrowing this too much. Like, let's not use that to try and then just align that with Pauline theology. It's all about how you respond to Jesus through his emissaries. I think that is here.
It's definitely part of it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. But there really is this theme, throughout the whole Bible, that faith has a fruit. There's a fruit to faith. And even in Jesus' teaching in this Passion Week, he's looked at the fig tree. Where is the fruit? I want to see the fruit. The fruit is the indication of the fact that the heart is made right. And the heart made right is a gift of God for those who trust him. So if we entrust our lives to Jesus, we trust in him, we're filled with the Holy Spirit, there should be evidence of that. And that is the fruitfulness of us participating in God's purpose. And that's what this is.
Yeah.
I think this is inclusive of that idea as well. And certainly in the early church, they certainly took that this way. They saw, we actually need to be reaching out to people, meeting people according to their needs and representing Jesus to them. And this is why the early church had such an enormous effect on its impact, at times where, in a culture where it was every man for himself, so to speak. The Christians lived this incredibly countercultural way of living and cared for the least, even, in the understanding that all people are God's children in the general sense,
creation,
and that what we do for the least of these is essentially our way of honouring Christ.
I like one commentary who summed that up basically by saying the criterion of judgment is not mere philanthropy, good as that is, but people's response to the kingdom of heaven as they have met it in the person of Jesus' brothers. So the people who bring them the message of Christ, how do they accept that?
Yeah.
That's consistent with both the faith and the works, isn't it?
So in summary, I think it's been taken in both senses, and I think we need to allow for both senses. You know, there's certainly the response to the message. That's the Abrahamic thing. Those who bless you will be blessed; those who curse you will be cursed. But I think there's also validity in the broader interpretation of this, in that clearly how we treat another person is a direct expression. Jesus talked that when as we love our neighbor as ourselves, it is actually an expression of our love for God. I mean, not necessarily. Again, it's not just philanthropy here, but as the fruit of the work of the transformation, the Holy Spirit, and our love for God. In as much as it is the fruit of that, it becomes the evidence of a life given over to Christ.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thrive Deeper. Our home on the internet is thrivetoday.tv. You can contact us, ask questions, see all our resources and much more at our website thrivetoday.tv. We really appreciate the questions and thoughts about what you're reading as we go through the Bible with Thrive. Until next time, our prayer is that these shows will inspire you to go deeper and thrive.